The sun never sets on KAEL-7. This is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is the physical reality of a world trapped in a dual orbit. Twin suns chase each other across the sky, one taking over from the other without pause, without mercy, without night. For 4,200 years, the humans who colonized KAEL-7 knew nothing but light. They grew crops that had never known the cold and raised children who had never seen the stars. Because on KAEL-7, stars do not exist. Only the suns, the heat, and the eternal day. Then came the year 4219. The news did not come with a cry, but with a number. In 47 years, the two suns of KAEL-7 would begin an orbital separation that would last 312 years. Welcome to History of the Future. The first colonists arrived on KAEL-7 after a journey that lasted more than 4 centuries. None of the humans who had left Earth were still alive when the ships reached their destination. Entire generations had been born, lived, and died within those structures. For their descendants, Earth was no longer a place, but a story, a memory inherited and preserved in archives passed down from generation to generation. When the first ships entered orbit, no one expected to find what lay beneath their feet. KAEL-7 seemed impossible. 2 suns illuminated the planet constantly. When one disappeared behind the horizon, the other took its place. There was no night, no change of seasons, and no winter. Darkness was simply something that happened on other worlds. The first settlements grew rapidly. Then came the cities, industries, and spaceports. Finally, the centuries passed. Many centuries. The colony prospered in a way that few human civilizations had ever achieved before. Crops grew year-round. Energy production was virtually unlimited. And the cities operated without interruption. Generation after generation, KAEL-7 became one of humanity's wealthiest worlds. As is the case with all civilizations that enjoy a long period of stability, its inhabitants began to assume that this balance would be permanent. The eternal day was no longer considered a coincidence or a temporary phase. For them, it was a law of nature. As the centuries passed, words like night, winter, and darkness gradually disappeared from everyday language. By the beginning of the year 4219, the planet's population exceeded 890 million. Crystal cities covered entire continents, and nothing on the surface seemed to suggest that this world could ever change. But beneath the surface, something different was happening. 5 kilometers below the surface, mining crews had been discovering strange structures for centuries. Thousands of kilometers of tunnels too large to be natural and too ancient to have been built by humans. Analyses revealed unusual patterns on the walls, signs of wear, repetitive erosion, and evidence consistent with biological movement. As if, for thousands of years, something had been passing through those tunnels. Reports accumulated over decades, until in the year 3847, the KAEL-7 Underground Institute published the most comprehensive study conducted to date. More than 4,000 pages, compiling decades of research. The conclusion took up just a few lines. There is evidence consistent with the existence of large life forms adapted to lightless environments. Their current activity is unknown. They are believed to be in a state of prolonged hibernation. The report was shelved. It did not cause public alarm or lead to large-scale investigations or emergency plans. At the time, it seemed like an irrelevant issue. After all, the suns continued to shine, and nothing seemed safer than a planet where the sun never set. While most of the inhabitants of KAEL-7 continued to live, under the illusion that their world would last forever, a very different reality was beginning to emerge at the orbital observatories. The discovery did not come suddenly. It came in the form of data. For decades, the observatories on KAEL-7 had been monitoring the orbits of its 2 suns. It was a routine, tedious, and predictable task, until the models began to show something impossible. At first, it was thought to be an error, then a statistical glitch, later an instrument malfunction. But the results kept coming in. All the calculations pointed to the same conclusion: the 2 suns would not remain together forever. Slowly, their orbits were changing, and that change would have catastrophic consequences. The simulations revealed a sequence that was impossible to stop. In just 47 years, the separation would begin. Decades later, the first cycles of day and night would appear. Later, nights would arrive that would last weeks, and eventually, months. Finally, they would last for centuries. Scientists calculated that KAEL-7 would remain in near total darkness for more than 300 years. It was neither a theory nor a remote possibility. It was an inevitable consequence of the laws of physics. For the first time in 4,000 years, the civilization of KAEL-7 realized that its world had an expiration date. Then began the greatest survival project ever attempted by humankind. The goal was simple to state, but nearly impossible to carry out. To build a civilization capable of surviving 3 centuries without light or sunrises, enduring extreme temperatures while entire generations were born and died without ever seeing the sun. The early years were lost amid discussions, reports, debates, and committees. Many remained convinced that there must be some mistake. Others believed that technology would eventually find a solution, but time kept marching on, and the calculations remained unchanged. Meanwhile, something else began to catch the researchers' attention. The ancient tunnels discovered beneath the surface were changing. Some sensors detected vibrations. Others recorded shifts in material. It wasn't enough to trigger an alarm, but it was enough to raise an uncomfortable question. If something had lain dormant for thousands of years beneath KAEL-7, was it a coincidence that it began to stir just as darkness approached? Humanity had survived wars, climate crises, and mass extinctions. But it had never attempted anything like this. The situation was simple to explain and terrifying to imagine. In less than half a century, KAEL-7 would begin its descent into a night that would ultimately last more than 300 years. There was no technology capable of preventing it, nor was there anywhere to flee to, nor any other planet capable of supporting hundreds of millions of people. For the first time since the colonists' arrival, survival depended on a single option: adapt. And so began the greatest engineering feat in human history. They did not build mere shelters or emergency bunkers. They built entire cities beneath the planet's surface. Kilometers of tunnels, fusion reactors, artificially lit farms, recycling systems designed to operate for centuries, water reserves, hospitals, schools, and research centers. Everything necessary for an entire civilization to continue existing without ever seeing sunlight again. Construction lasted for decades and consumed unimaginable amounts of resources. Entire continents were transformed. Mountains were drilled through, and several oceans were partially drained to power the new industrial complexes. Millions of people worked their entire lives on a project whose results they would never live to see. Because the cities weren't being built for them. They were being built for their descendants. However, engineers quickly discovered that the cold wasn't the only problem. There was another risk that was much more difficult to resolve. As the underground cities grew beneath KAEL-7, research into the ancient tunnels continued. The deeper the teams went, the harder it became to explain what they were finding. The tunnels never ended. Every year, new branches, corridors, and structures appeared, as if the network were extending far beyond what anyone had imagined. At first, it was believed that they were the remains of a lost civilization. Later, it was suggested that they might be unknown natural formations. But both explanations began to fall apart for a very simple reason. The tunnels were changing. Some passages mapped decades earlier appeared to have been altered. Others had disappeared. In places where nothing had existed before, new tunnels were beginning to open up. Scientists reviewed the data over and over again. They looked for sensor errors, mapping flaws, and problems with the measurement systems. The conclusion remained the same. Something was moving beneath KAEL-7. Something enormous, capable of altering a network of tunnels that spanned entire continents. And the closer night drew, the more frequent that activity became. Reports began to pile up. Then came the first missing expeditions, the first teams that stopped transmitting, and finally, a recommendation that for centuries would have seemed absurd. Avoid certain regions of the subsurface. For the first time since the settlers' arrival, there were areas of KAEL-7 that no one wanted to descend into. A possibility began to resurface in scientific meetings, classified reports, and private conversations. What if the tunnels weren't ruins? What if they never had been? Because if that were true, humanity wasn't building cities on an empty planet. It was building them on something that was still alive. There were 17 years left until the Great Winter. The underground cities were nearly complete. The reactors were operational, and reserves were growing every year. For the first time since the discovery of the Great Night, humanity was beginning to believe it might survive. That was when the problems began, not on the surface. Beneath the ground. It all began with minor incidents. Tools appearing in places where no one had left them. Sensors shifting out of position and teams returning with readings that defied explanation. Nothing serious. Nothing to warrant alarm. But the incidents kept piling up, and they were occurring at ever greater depths. Some workers claimed to have seen movement at the end of empty tunnels. Others spoke of shadows and enormous figures that vanished before they could focus on them. Most of those accounts were dismissed. Stress, fatigue, months on end working underground. It was a reasonable explanation. Until they stopped being isolated cases. The same stories began to repeat themselves in regions thousands of kilometers apart. People who had never met described exactly the same sensation. Something was watching them from beyond the reach of the lights. Retreating every time they tried to get closer. Scientists sought an explanation. Then the data came in. The tunnels kept changing. Some passages seemed to have been widened, others had been blocked off. And in areas that had been mapped for generations, entirely new corridors were beginning to open up. This no longer seemed like geology. It seemed like maintenance. as if someone were still working on that network, as if the tunnels were still in use. The situation worsened when an exploration probe managed to detect something. It wasn't a clear image or the silhouette of a creature, just movement. Continuous movement for several hours. Something was moving through the depths, following a specific route. Then, another probe detected the same thing, and then another. Always far away, always out of sight, always moving. The calculations based on those signals led to an uncomfortable silence among the researchers. This was not a single animal or a small group. The activity stretched for thousands of kilometers, as if an entire population existed beneath the surface of KAEL-7, a population that had been hidden for thousands of years and now seemed to be awakening. The conclusion was so unsettling that it remained classified for years. Perhaps humans had not been the first inhabitants of the planet. Perhaps they had never been alone. As millions of people prepared to descend into the underground cities, one question began to be repeated in laboratories, command centers, and emergency meetings. If something had managed to survive all the previous winters, what had it been doing while waiting for the next one? Night was falling, and for the first time since the colonists' arrival, there was reason to believe that someone else was waiting for it too. There wasn't enough room for everyone. That was the truth no one wanted to say out loud for 47 years. The underground cities could keep a civilization alive for 3 centuries. But they couldn't house all 890 million inhabitants of KAEL-7. The calculations were unyielding. Air was limited, food was limited, energy was limited. At the end of every equation, the same number always appeared. 200 million. That was all that could be saved. The rest would have to remain on the surface. When the descents began, millions of people realized that darkness wouldn't be the only problem. Some would go down, others wouldn't. And no one really knew which of the two groups was luckier. The hatches closed and the reactors began to run. The root cities vanished beneath kilometers of rock. Then night fell. When darkness enveloped KAEL-7, humanity expected to face cold and hunger. What it didn't expect was to face the planet's true inhabitants. The first reports from the surface arrived just a few weeks after the suns disappeared. At first, they were confusing. They didn't reveal anything conclusive until they began to draw closer. They weren't animals, and they didn't behave like predators. They didn't attack for food or territory. They seemed to be searching for something. For months, they surrounded the shelters on the surface, watching them and waiting. Then the raids began. They would come in during the night and take people away. The survivors tried to defend themselves. Because those creatures had not emerged from the depths to coexist with humanity. They had come out to reclaim their world. The cities, mines, orbital ports, and power plants had been built on a planet that had already been inhabited long before the colonists arrived. Now its inhabitants had returned. The shelters began to disappear one after another. The last messages received from the surface grew increasingly disturbing. The creatures seemed to know the human cities inside and out. They had spent centuries observing, waiting, and preparing. That civilization had not awakened with the arrival of the Great Winter. It had remained there all that time, hidden and patient, waiting for the one moment when it knew humans would be vulnerable, because they knew the truth about KAEL-7. They knew that light was the exception. They knew that darkness was the norm. And they knew that sooner or later, the suns would disappear. However, the story of KAEL-7 was not going to end with a retreat. Humanity had crossed the void between the stars to reach that place. It had spent 4,000 years building that world and had buried entire generations beneath its skies. Now it discovered that it had never been alone. What lay ahead would no longer be a struggle against the cold or the darkness. It would be a struggle to decide who would inherit KAEL-7 when the night ended. Because, for the first time since the colonists' arrival, the future of the species did not depend on surviving the winter. It depended on surviving the planet's owners.